Over 5,000 years ago, a great civilization began to take shape here in Egypt. The ancient Egyptians were talented builders who created hundreds of beautiful temples, enormous pyramids, and fantastic monuments at which we still marvel today. But the ancient Egyptians were not only skilled builders, they were excellent craftsmen and engineers as well. And nearly everything they did was influenced by their mysterious religion. Religion even played a key role in the way Egypt was governed, allowing it to become the first country in the world to have an organized government that was strong enough to rule millions of people who lived across a very large geographical area. Over a span of some 3,000 years, the civilization of ancient Egypt was born, grew old, and finally died. But while it lasted, it was one of the most magnificent civilizations the world has ever seen. So now, let us go back in time and find out what it was like to live during this amazing period of history. The nation of Egypt developed in the northeastern corner of the African continent around the year 3000 BC, on lands where the mighty Nile River cuts through the Sahara Desert. The people of Egypt could never have survived in such a harsh environment without the Nile, for it not only provided water for drinking, its water also turned the desert into a paradise where plants thrived in the hot, sunny weather. Every summer, far upstream in Central Africa, heavy rains washed large amounts of topsoil and plant material into the river. Downstream in Egypt, these rains caused the river to overflow, but each year after it returned to normal, a rich new layer of soil was left behind. Over countless centuries, this soil was deposited along the banks of the Nile. And where the river flowed into the Mediterranean Sea, it created a region of fertile islands called the Nile Delta. The combination of sun, water, and rich soil made it possible to raise excellent crops here and have a dependable supply of food. And having abundant food is what really made it possible for the great civilization of Egypt to develop in the way that it did. Just as they did thousands of years ago, the Egyptians of today still farm on the delta of the Nile. Many of their crops, such as barley, wheat, and dates, are the same as those that fed the ancient Egyptians, and many of their farming methods are pretty much the same as well, for a lot of work is still done by hand, or with the help of domesticated animals that have been trained to plow the fields and bring water to the crops. 3,000 years ago, Egyptian farmers and other ordinary people lived in simple houses much like this one, that were made from bricks of sun-dried mud. Most houses were built in villages near the fields, but on higher land, where they would be safe from the Nile's yearly flood. From their villages, the ancient Egyptians could gaze out at the ships passing by, which were their nation's main form of transportation. For the Nile was Egypt's superhighway, flowing from one end of the country to the other. Some of the ships that passed by might be heading to a nearby town to pick up a cargo of clay jugs needed for hauling water, wine, and oil. or perhaps to unload a shipment of valuable spices from some far distant land, while other ships might be carrying government officials, soldiers, or even building stones for a new temple. In ancient Egypt, the head of the government was called the pharaoh, and every citizen was obliged to serve him and follow his commands. All the land and all the people of Egypt belonged to the pharaoh. The Egyptians believed that every pharaoh was the child of the god of the sun. As a living god, the pharaoh was quite different from the rest of the people. Everything he wore and everything he used in his daily life was designed for him alone. People believed that through his divine powers, the pharaoh could keep their country safe and prosperous. For example, every year for more than 25 centuries, the pharaohs performed a ceremony to make sure the Nile flood would bring a new layer of rich soil so they would have good crops. And because the ancient Egyptians believed that at night the sun made a journey through the land of the dead, every morning the pharaoh performed a special ceremony to bring back the sun and restart life again in his kingdom. As a living god, the pharaoh was the religious leader of Egypt. But it was the sun god Re, whose image is seen here, that was really the main god of their country. The ancient Egyptians worshipped many different gods and goddesses, and each one had their own special supernatural powers. Horus, the falcon-headed god whose image is seen here, was the god of heaven, and the pharaoh himself was believed to be this god in human form. People in different parts of the country had their own favorite gods and built temples for them. For example, in part of southern Egypt, they built this temple to Isis, queen of all the gods, and the goddess of women. While in the north, in one part of the delta, they built temples to Osiris, the god of death and rebirth. This temple honored Hathor, the goddess of love, and was built by a great pharaoh for his favorite wife. Temples owned large amounts of farmland. In fact, at one time, a third of all the land of Egypt belonged to the temples. The crops raised on their lands were used to support the huge number of people who worked at the temples. Temples were believed to be sacred palaces where the god's spirit lived. Ordinary Egyptians never entered the temples. Instead, priests performed ceremonies inside them to please the gods, asking for their help in preventing disasters and to bring good fortune. During these ceremonies, food was offered, and the god's statue was lovingly washed and rubbed with precious oils. And during special festivals, the statue of the god was taken from the temple and carried through the streets for all to see. Egyptian temples were not only places of worship, they were also places of learning where a few people could go to study reading, writing, and mathematics. There is no doubt that the Egyptian civilization was successful because it produced educated people. But also, and nearly as important, Egypt produced a lot of paper upon which they could write. Egyptians made paper from the plant called papyrus, seen here, that grew thickly along the riverbanks. Paper makers would cut stalks of papyrus and strip off the thick green outer layer of the stems to get to the soft center inside. The center was then cut into long strips and laid on a heavy slab, first in one direction and then in the other. Next, a second heavy slab was placed on top, so that with pressure, the strips joined together to form a single piece of paper. The ancient Egyptians wrote on paper and carved in stone in their own special kind of writing called hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphic writing was very complicated because it had 700 symbols used to represent different sounds, as well as an alphabet of 24 letters. For example, this was the hieroglyphic letter for T, this for N, and this for B. When it came to writing down numbers, things were much simpler. Numbers from 1 to 9 were made using short lines, so that one line meant 1, 2 lines meant 2, and so forth. But because they had no zero, they had to use different symbols for the numbers 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and 1,000,000. So in ancient Egypt, the number 46 would have been written like this, using 4 tens and 6 ones. Because they learned to work with numbers, the ancient Egyptians were able to develop certain kinds of mathematics. In fact, over 45 centuries ago, mathematics were used in drawing up the plans for this huge pyramid, because to build it correctly, more than 2 million blocks of heavy stone had to be perfectly cut and then arranged in a very accurate way. Pyramids like these were royal tombs and were built to last forever through the back-breaking labor of tens of thousands of men. In ancient Egypt, large royal tombs were often guarded by huge statues like this one, called sphinxes, which depicted the pharaoh's head on the body of a powerful lion. Besides sphinxes, tall monuments called obelisks covered with hieroglyphics also were placed outside of royal tombs. Tombs were extremely important to the ancient Egyptians, for they believed that the dead person's spirit, or Ka, could survive forever inside the tomb. But for this to happen, the body had to first be preserved by turning it into a mummy. Mummies were made by specially trained priests who wore the mask of the jackal-headed god Anubis while they prepared the body for burial. They began by removing the brain, liver, lungs, intestines, and stomach. Then the organs and the entire body were completely covered with a salt mixture to dry them out. After drying for 1.5 to 2 months, the salt was removed and the body cavity was filled with fresh linen and fragrant spices. Then the body was rubbed with cedar oil. Each of the 4 organs was placed in a different clay jar. And then the body was wrapped in many layers of linen cloth, to which magical amulets were added. Finally, the mummy was placed in a coffin and taken to its tomb, which had been filled with food, clothing, and other things needed in the afterlife. At the door to the tomb, priests performed special ceremonies. One ceremony was supposed to bring the spirit back to the body, and another was designed to bring the paintings on the walls of the tomb to life. It was believed that after all these things had been done, the person's spirit would be led into the hall of judgment, where the god Anubis knelt, holding the scales of justice. On one side of the scale was the person's heart, while on the other side was the sacred feather of Ma'at, the goddess of justice. If the person had led a good life, his heart was lighter than the sacred feather. But if the person had led a bad life, the heart side dropped. After the weighing was done, the ruler of the dead, the god Osiris, decided his fate. Spirits with heavy hearts were turned into demons, but those whose hearts were light and good went with Osiris to dwell forever in the land of the dead. Today, the religious beliefs of ancient Egypt may seem quite odd, but back then, they were just part of daily life. And as we have seen, those strange beliefs helped shape an amazing civilization that was so successful it lasted for thousands of years, even in spite of the fact that the ancient Egyptians rarely went to war, preferring instead to live their lives in peace and comfort. For the average Egyptian of 4,000 years ago, Egypt was a universe all its own, surrounded by desert and nourished by the Nile. For them, being an Egyptian meant worshiping Egyptian gods, following the pharaoh, and above all else, dying and being buried in Egypt. True or false? Pharaohs were believed to be the children of the sun god. True or false? Re was the name of the moon god in ancient Egypt. True or false? The god Horus was the ruler of the dead. True or false? A sphinx was a type of large Egyptian boat. True or false? The papyrus plant was very important in ancient Egypt. True or false? Hathor was an ancient Egyptian goddess. True or false? Pharaohs were not allowed to perform religious ceremonies. True or false? The pyramids were built to be the palaces of the pharaohs. True or false? Obelisks were tall monuments carved from stone. True or false? Hieroglyphics was the name of Egypt's greatest pharaoh.